If you have a heel block and you have a mortise, now you have to have a tenon that goes with it. And so today I'm going to do a follow-up video from the one I did yesterday on making a jig and using a jig that will do this job, making the mortise. Today I'm going to go over making that tenon. I have two separate jigs that I use to do this with. They both do exactly the same job, but you'll see why I have to have two of them. So without delay, we'll get started. Here are the two jigs that I use to form neck tenons. They are identical for the most part, with the exception of one feature. I mentioned that I need two of these, and the reason is really pretty simple. This spline that's right here in this jig is 1/4 inch wide. It happens to be aluminum, but the material is not important. In this jig, this spline, which is just wood, is 3/8 of an inch wide. And I'm sure you've already guessed why that's been done. The truss rod slot that's in a neck is what is registered against that spline. The two have to coordinate. So since some of my truss rod slots are 3/8 and others are 1/4 inch, then I have the need for both of those jigs. Otherwise, they are pretty much identical, and they are identical in their function and in the way they're set up and used. Now, one of these is laid down so that you can see what's underneath, inside, so to speak, and the other one is clamped to the bench as if I were going to put it to use right away. The first thing is that the table on this is adjustable. It's hinged, and it doesn't need to move as far as you see it moving here. But as you know, you're going to make a neck angle when you cut the tenon. The router will not just cut the tenon, but it will also cut the neck heel itself, as you can see in this example right here. Okay, so we need to have the table adjustable, and it only needs to be probably a whole range of not more than 5 degrees. I'm sure would be pretty adequate. And I made these bars out of aluminum. They don't have to be aluminum at all. They could be wood. Behind these bolts are brass threaded inserts that you drill in, and once you drill them in, if you soak the outside of them with super glue, they become really nice and tight and they work well. So that one is there, and there's the same thing behind this knob to adjust it with. Got a little slot there so that that'll travel, and it works real well. Brass inserts and T-nuts and leftover knobs and things like this that you can get your hands on are all real handy. So if you're into making tools, collect all of this kind of hardware and different leftover parts that you can find. So the next component is this aluminum rod right here. Now this rod is what guides the router. It is exactly 750 thousandths of an inch thick, and even cheap uncertified aluminum will be within 2 or 3 thousandths of that size. You don't need, you can buy what's called certified aluminum. Its size is literally documented, but you don't need that. I used a piece of 3/4 by 3/4 stock, or excuse me, 3/4 by 1 inch stock, and I milled this slot so that I can adjust this as well. You don't need to do that. You could make this out of wood. If you do, however, this wants to be very good stiff stuff, and I would use like a hard maple, or even if you have something really good and stable that's even harder, you know, if you left over rosewood or something, I don't know. But it wants to be stable and very, very stiff so that there's no wavering when the router moves around it. And it does need to be adjustable by some means. The aluminum allows for that slot and that bolt to hold it still. Wood might cause that to be a little more fragile, but I'm sure something else could be worked out to make that happen. Now, it's critical in these jigs that the spline here and this rod, that their center lines coincide absolutely and perfectly. They cannot be so to speak, out of phase with each other. They must be center line to center line. And it's absolutely critical that this guide for the router be strictly at 90 degrees to this surface. And that implies, therefore, that this table or this opening be at 90 degrees to that surface as well. Now I use piano hinges to put these together with because that's what I happen to have. You could use almost any type of hinge, but if you were to go to the store and buy smaller, say 3/4 hinges or inch hinges or whatever, even door hinges would do just fine, loose pin hinges. If you do that, they might slop a little bit. So when you screw them down, uh, ever so slightly oppose your hinges out of phase with each other and tighten the screws down, because that will allow that to move and hinge, but it won't bind, and it will make it so that your table won't flop back and forth. It'll remain right where you want it to be. So getting all of this lined up and getting all of this strictly square can be a little bit nerve-wracking, but if you prepare what you're doing, use your router to mill that slot so that the spline fits it, or you could use a table saw, either way you want to go, and you can make all of this work. It's just not that tough to do. I did find when I made this jig, I did it, so to speak, the hard way. I found an easier method as I move around the jig here. I made this up. This is out of white ash. Uh, I made this whole thing up, and then I cut this slot in it with a router, which it works just fine. But I found an easier, less nerve-wracking way, which I'm going to show you on this other jig. I hope you can see this, but right here is a center laminate in that. Can you see the joint here and here? You could see it if I'd put the camera up there, wouldn't you? Okay, so there's that centerpiece. What I did was I made this half of the table, I made this half of the table, I made sure they were all the same thickness, drum sanded down and so on. And then I made this center piece to be glued in. And that way I could check it to make sure that it corresponds exactly to the width of this, because I want this to slide in and out without flopping back and forth. I put this piece in, but I had cut this open so that it's easier to do when you got two pieces. I cut this open, and then I glued in this stick right here, but I only glued it here. I did not put glue in it back here. And when I clamped it up, the whole thing comes together, and then when I take it out of the clamps, you can take a handsaw or whatever, you cut that off right there, this piece slips out, and this piece slides right back in. It made it a little more accurate, a little easier to do. Now on the back side, you can see that I have this block mounted to keep the two halves of the table together and to keep them from opening and closing at all. And you can see I put a lot of screws in there to keep that in position. There is a T-nut under here, which corresponds to this. It corresponds to this rod right here. And this bolt goes down into that T-nut to hold that still. All of this has to be, as I mentioned before, nicely squared up. It's very important that that's all squared up. I think lastly, I use these large Destaco clamps because when that neck goes in there, I want that thing to stay still. There is no room for movement. The neck can't be allowed to flop and vibrate in any way. It's got to be stable. So there it is. It's not all that difficult to make, but a little time consuming. I guess lastly, this block right here, and also this one, these are there just to keep this surface nicely flat, to resist any movement, because it is wood after all. And this one does the same thing, but it allows me to clamp the jig to my workbench. So the first thing I need to do is I need to cut the neck to its proper length. that means that I'll establish from the nut position over here to, in this case, the 14th fret position over here, plus the length of that tenon. I make my tenons a 1/2 inch long. By the time the rims are glued onto that heel block, that makes the whole tenon about 9/16 deep or thereabouts, depending on rim thickness. So I gauge the guitar body to determine what that neck angle actually has to be, and then on the table saw or a cut-off saw, or by whatever means, sometimes even a bandsaw, I will cut that neck angle. And I check that against the guitar. I'll set that on top of the guitar body and put a straight edge on there, make sure I've got the proper air gap where the bridge is going to be placed at that point, and I go from there. So it's important that I have the neck angle that I want. My next step is to install the neck in the jig and bring it up and literally allow the table to match that neck angle, and then tighten it down. This makes it very easy. There's no guesswork as to what angle you need. If your neck angle is correct, you just set the jig to it and you're good to go. The next thing I'll have to do is adjust the router guide bar itself. To understand the length of the tenon that I need, I've measured that against the heel block, and I've put a mark here to determine the extremity of that tenon. And now we'll set up the guide bar to go along with it. Now you can see here that I've positioned the neck into the jig, but my guide bar sticks out too far. So that's why all of this business over here was critical, because this has to move. So I don't know if you can see that well enough, but I'm adjusting that bar right up to the mark that I put showing the length of the tenon, and I just tighten that down a little bit, and now the jig is ready to be used, except for one small issue. So I've got my jig set up. I'm using a full-size router for this because a small laminate trim router is not durable enough for this work. I'm using a 3/4 inch bit with a top bearing on it, and the top bearing, of course, rides on this guide here. My tenon is going to be a 1/2 inch deep, which I marked down here on the heel and adjusted the router up and down to make sure that we have all of that. I've put a garbage bag around this. I wrapped it around the jig because this thing flings dirt and dust everywhere. So I just do it because if not, it's all over the shop. So I'm going to give this a quick run, and you'll see the chips fly all over hell. So with the smoke of battle cleared, we just remove the neck from the jig, and there you can see that you have a tenon nicely formed. This little leftover and flash over here, that doesn't mean anything. That's gonna come off when you cut the heel anyway. So if anybody that watches this has any questions about this, or things you'd like to know about it that maybe I failed to discuss, please, in the comments, write them in there, and I'll watch and I'll try and answer your questions as best as I can. I am the Pragmatic Luther, Kevin Ledoux at Ledoux Guitars. I hope you liked the video, and I hope you'll subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that already. And remember, I am the biggest manufacturer of acoustic guitars in the entire town of Triangle, New York.